tell any secrets of the Mau Mau, this oath will kill me. If I am called in the night and refuse to come, this oath will kill me. If I see anyone steal white man's property, I must help him. I must hide what he gives me and say nothing, or this oath will kill me.
The whole system in this country, the economic system, is such that jobs are scarce. Automation is limiting jobs. It's decreasing jobs. And as automation eliminates the job opportunities, legislation will not create job opportunities. All it will do is bring about friction and hostility between the two races.
You see, there will be no progressive revival if black folks are not deeply involved in it.
I will obey all orders of the Mau Mau, or this oath will kill me.
Good evening, friends, comrades, and enemies. I am the host of the Mau Mau Hour, Pascal Robert. Welcome to our show this evening. The Mau Mau Hour is when we discuss politics from a left perspective. Sometimes we talk about black politics. We talk about issues from a more radical, sometimes interesting perspective that we don't normally discuss on the show. I am the host of the Mau Mau Hour. And today we're going to talk about a perspective that came about through a very good friend of mine, political science professor Corey Robin, who was at Brooklyn College, who wrote a piece in the New Yorker that encapsulated the moment that we're seeing today. After the October 7th political flare-ups that we had in the Middle East, you saw a large reaction people were expecting from the quote-unquote Jewish community in terms of what their politics should be, as if there is one unified Jewish community that has one voice that can have someone represent it. And people always ask, well, how is this going to affect Jewish politics and the Jewish worldview, and how should Jewish people respond to this? While Palestinians protested as well in the streets in terms of the deaths that were being laid to rest in the Gaza Strip. So what's interesting to me is that oftentimes the reaction to the politics of the Middle East when asking about the Jewish community is always laid to bear on the hands of the AIPAC Zionist liberals. And no one fails to realize that there are Jews who are opposed to the Zionist activities of the State of Israel. And there are some who are liberal supporters of Zionism but are still critical of Israel. There's a wide range of politics within the Jewish community, as there are any other community. But what Corey is talking about in this piece is that in America, Jews pioneered a way of life that didn't rely on the whims of the powerful. Now it's under threat. So Corey Robin is the esteemed political science professor, is the author of The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, The Reactionary Mind and Fear. He's the distinguished professor of political sciences at Brooklyn College and SUNY Graduate Center. Please welcome my friend Corey Robin. Hello, Corey. Thank you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Pascal. It's good to see you.
See you too. I hope my intro did you justice. So, Corey, I'm interested in this formulation of Jewish politics, and I'm looking at it as the same way I look at the formulation of black politics, which is maybe why I'm a little hesitant to look at it, because when I discuss black politics nowadays, I ask, is there a justification to have a quote-unquote black politics in light of the fact of how badly black politics has served the interests of the black community? What exactly is the merit, if you will, to staying with that that titular name of Jewish politics? What are your arguments to that?
Well, I mean, I think the merit, you've sort of hinted at it already, is that in the discourse, oftentimes the Jewish community is represented as a single unitary community, and with a single spokesperson, or a single organization that represents them. And one of the reasons why I didn't come up with the title, but the reason that I think it's helpful is that in a certain way, that was very much the style of how the Jewish community dealt with politics in Europe, going back a long, long way. It was represented as a singular community. Oftentimes in modern states had an official Jewish organization that was authorized by the state to speak for the Jewish people to the state. And it was a very elitist brokerage model of politics. And one of the reasons why it's helpful to name it that way is that was very different from how Jews began interacting with the state and with politics in the United States, really going back to the Revolutionary era. So the main value, I think, about the term is that it captures something about the European experience of Jews, but shows that when we talk about Jews in the United States this way, this is very different from historically how Jews had gone about engaging in politics. And we could talk more about what that was. But I think that's the primary value of the term, is that it shows it's a kind of European orientation, a very old world orientation that a lot of American Jews broke with.
Right. Now that's interesting, because there are elements of the black worker class that we have in America that are still using that brokerage model.
Yeah.
And unfortunately have not found a way to the independent kind of position, because I actually argue that the utility of having that kind of model is obsolete altogether.
Yeah.
Frankly, completely, particularly in terms of trying to argue that you represent 14% of the population, which is, when Jews are only 2% of the population, and it's hard enough to do it with them.
Right.
Can you imagine doing it with 14%?
Right.
But can you talk more about the formulations of what the two two models of Jewish politics traditionally have been?
Sure. So, I think when people think about Jews in politics or Jews in the state in the long run of history, you oftentimes have this notion that Jews were always this oppressed people. They were always beaten down by the state. They were always marginalized. They were always subjugated. That's at least the kind of conventional way Jews tell their own story to themselves, and it's often the way Jewish history is depicted by others, by non-Jews. The truth is that, and this goes actually back to antiquity, so even before Europe emerges as a form, Jews always, for a lot of complicated reasons that we don't have to go into, but did use this brokerage model. You see this actually going back to the book of Genesis. Remember, the story of Joseph. Joseph is one of the patriarchs of the Jewish people, and he is very close with Pharaoh. And in fact, there's this little part of the story that doesn't get a lot of attention, neither in synagogues or churches, nor in the musical about Joseph and his magic Technicolor Dreamcoat. But he was so close with Pharaoh that he, in dealing with the famine that Egypt was dealing with, ancient Egypt, he basically comes up with a plan to slowly divest Egyptian peasants of their land, their currency, their wealth, and ultimately their labor, effectively making them serfs of the state. And so this is a model of how, that's a religious story, but you also see it in secular texts as well, going back to about how Jews in Alexandria dealt with. It's a very elite-driven model where you have a kind of figure that's very high up in the Jewish community, that's very close to the sovereign, whether it's Pharaoh in Egypt, or later the Roman emperors or things like that, and is able to kind of protect his community by making deals and providing services to Pharaoh, but often separating and keeping the community at a distance from other oppressed groups. And this is a tradition that continues into Europe during the Middle Ages and into the early modern era. And there's a term that I use in the piece. It's a famous term from history, the court Jew. During the early modern era, monarchs are looking for looking for resources to finance their wars, increase their financial base, and these court Jews play that service. And in return, they get protection for their community, special protections for their community. So that's the one model, and it's a very elite brokerage model, and it's very European. When Jewish people come to the United States, they instantly are thrown into a very different situation. It's first of all, it's a much more pluralistic experience. There's no unified Jewish community. There wasn't really in Europe either, but there's certainly none in the United States. And Jews find themselves beginning to make alliances with other oppressed religious minorities, the Huguenots in South Carolina, most famously. And they start petitioning for rights, not just on behalf of themselves, but in coalition with other groups, and are able to pioneer this coalitional model of politics that is both specific to Jewish people, but also in alliance with non-Jews as well. And this develops throughout the 19th century. I mean, one of my favorite stories, actually going back to the 18th century, is during the celebrations of the ratification of the Constitution. In Philadelphia, Jewish groups march with other groups to celebrate the ratification of the Constitution, and at the end there's a festive meal. And the Jewish community, the Jewish group in Philadelphia, what they do is, they march with these other groups, and then they have their own table at the meal with kosher food. And it's a nice story to me because it shows the ability to be both particular on the one hand, but also in alliance and coalitional and even universal on the other hand. And that's very different, I argue in the piece, from the European experience. And the culmination of this kind of coalitional politics is, of course, the alliance between, and one can get very romantic and misty-eyed about this, but the fact of the matter is there was an alliance between blacks and Jews in the civil rights struggle. And it wasn't because Jews were like just good people and just thinking about black people because, they're just altruistic. It was because Jews saw that the only way to have protection for Jewish people was to live in a full and complete democracy. You had to have full rights and freedoms for everyone. And so many Jews saw the Brown decision as the culmination of a Jewish dream, which was to live in a full and integrated society where you could be both Jewish and a citizen. And again, that's a very different model from Europe. And so the punchline of the piece is that today, it's not just today, it's been developing over the last 40 to 50 years, Jews have really begun to move away from that more democratic, pluralistic model. And instead, we're reverting back to this European model where we turn to organizations like AIPAC and look to both Republicans and Democrats to protect us. And so you get, these, really idiotic situations where you have the Republican Party, which has, many openly anti-Semitic people in it, proclaiming their allegiance to the Jewish people because they love the state of Israel so much. That's an obvious story. More troubling to me is when you get people like Joe Biden saying things like to Jewish organization leaders, he said it multiple times. This in your guts. When push comes to shove, it doesn't matter how committed and involved you are in the American democratic project. What ultimately is going to protect you is the state of Israel. And I find statements like that.
I read that in your piece and I was horrified.
Yeah.
I was absolutely, when you have a United States president telling members of the Jewish community, listen, we love you, but the only place that's going to protect you is that place over there with that Star of David with Bibi. That's the only place.
Right.
I mean, he's basically telling you that we can have a Holocaust over here.
Yeah. It's
absurd.
It's really abject. I mean, I feel like Jews shouldn't be. Jews should be horrified by this, and many, some of them are not. They think, yes, that's true, and I think it's horrific, but it's also, as you say, it's absolutely absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous, and but everybody should be horrified by this, because the idea is that you can say to one group of people who are citizens of this country, this isn't going to protect you, and that's just it's a betrayal of democratic values, but it's also, I think, a betrayal of the Jewish tradition in America, which understood, even very late into the 1930s, the biggest argument to Roosevelt by Jewish people was not the state of Israel; it was open up the border, let refugees into the country, because that's what they believed in, is that the United States could be a haven for oppressed people, not not the state of Israel. Now, there's all kinds of complications with that story. It doesn't deal with the question of African Americans and other groups who have been oppressed in this country, but I think that's the basic thrust of the argument.
So what do you think is the act? I mean, because people always are talking about, organizations like ADL, AIPAC, and things of that nature, but how are they threatening the normal political relationship of non-Zionist Jews' ability to have a political voice in this country, or even liberal secular Jews, liberal secular Zionist Jews?
It's a really excellent question. I'm glad you raised it. I mean, first and foremost, these protests on campus that we had all this past year, many of them involved Jewish students. I mean, they were broad coalitional protests. And so when the ADL and all these organizations start denouncing these protesters as anti-Semites, who ought to, and not just calling them anti-Semites, which is, if you're Jewish, I mean, if you're anybody in this country, that's a real stigmatizing label. And it's meant to be a way of delegitimizing, in this instance, people who are just critics of the state of Israel. But regardless of that, it's not just the label and the stigma. Then they, are starting to use all kinds of, provisions of the law to start, bringing charges against these people as, creating Title VI violations on campus, creating discrimination against other Jewish students and Jewish professors, and so it becomes not just a way of delegitimizing protests against Israel. It really becomes a way of starting to punish people who are engaging in that activity, many of whom are Jewish. So it's not just a metaphorical attack on dissenters within the Jewish community. It's a real attempt to use the arm of the law in alliance with university administrators to try to silence people who happen to be Jewish. Excuse me.
That's incredible. So, do you see is there an internal debate within spaces within the Jewish community about how this is playing out? Are there rooms for discussion on these realities in Jewish places?
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to give you a two-part answer. The first part is that in many ways the discussion around Israel is been the most open and critical among Jews that I've seen in my lifetime. I broke with the state of Israel and Zionism back in the early 1990s when I was in my 20s, and that was a really, a very difficult position to take. It creates divisions among families and friends and all the rest of it. But I think in the last couple of years, you've seen, particularly among younger Jewish people, a real explosion in critical discourse around the state of Israel. And so I think that's the positive side. I will say on the negative side that I think, synagogues have tended to get more shut down around this issue. And that's a real problem because the synagogue is the main institutional setting for collective Jewish life. And that really makes it difficult for people who are Jewish, want to be Jewish, want to affirm that Judaism is a weird religion for many people who are not Jewish, because it's both a religion and a people, or a religion and a people, and that's sort of hard sometimes for others to understand. But if you want to partake in that sense of peoplehood, you oftentimes do it in a synagogue, and synagogues have become much more nervous around this question around the state of Israel. They tend to shut down a little bit more. So I think there's both an opening in non-synagogue spaces and on campuses and so forth, but there's also been a kind of closure as well. And I think there's a real struggle. I mean, right now, I think there's, I hate this kind of phrasing because it sounds so sort of sentimental and romantic, but there is a bit of a struggle over the soul of what it means to be Jewish, not just in the United States, but I think, across the world. People are really struggling with this question, which may seem, again, I understand if you're not Jewish, that may seem like, well, Crimea River, the state of Israel is killing Palestinians every day. And, the struggle for the soul of the Jewish people may seem, pales in comparison to that. And I completely understand that position. Nevertheless, it's true that I think Jews are really struggling with this question of how to be Jewish without the state of Israel.
Would you not argue that the larger challenge is what Zionism means to Jewish people?
Yes, absolutely. And I think sorry about this. I think what's going on right now is, and I think part of why older Jewish people feel very threatened is that a lot of younger Jewish people are not just criticizing the state of Israel or criticizing Netanyahu or criticizing, Likud or the current policies. They are really breaking with the whole idea of Zionism, and embracing, in certain cases, what we call a kind of diasporic model of Judaism, to say that, the truth of the matter is that historically, Judaism was a diasporic religion. We were a people who were scattered. The creation of the state of Israel is a fairly recent development in Jewish history. And so I think a lot of younger Jews are, really breaking, again, not just with the government and not just the leadership of the state of Israel, but with the whole idea of the state of Israel, to say, it's just not, it's not for me. It's not who I am. I mean, the piece, I say this in response to that Biden thing about, the state of Israel will protect you. The fact is that I'm Jewish. I'm not Israeli. And I know for a lot of people, those two things go together. But for most Jews, for a lot of Jews, they don't. I shouldn't say most. They don't go together. And I think you're seeing that, again, amongst younger Jews, really just saying, that's not who I am. That's not part of my sense of collective peoplehood.
What are the ways in which the United States state play on the emotional connection to Israel amongst Jews to protect its political realpolitik in the Middle East?
I mean, you see this all the time, right? I mean, just in a very crude way, Trump, who was, the state of Israel's big, he says, I'm the state of Israel's biggest supporter. He's not lying when he says it. It's true. And he'll say, I don't understand how any Jew could vote against me, and be serious. You're not Jewish if you don't vote for me. And he's crude, but the value of the crudeness is he brings out a larger dispensation among American government officials who it's a kind of mutual game of blackmail between Jewish organizations that are very pro-Israel and American state officials for whom the state of Israel is a key ally, in terms of pursuing its broader Middle East politics and aims. And they, play the same game, calling out Jewish people as anti-Semites who, really want to break with this, this policy. I mean, this, you saw this a lot. I mean, I'm sure you remember the John Mearsheimer book. God, now I can't remember the name of it, but it came out about AIPAC and the lobby. That's what it was called.
Right.
And really naming this organization. And it was Mearsheimer and Walt. And what's interesting about these two is that they come from they come from that world of realpolitik that you were just talking about. And they were saying, based on realpolitik, the United States really had to break with the state of Israel. And they were pounded as anti-Semites, which was ridiculous, because it was kind of like, the calls coming from within the house. It was these two very traditional IR scholars really saying that there's a real cost to this alliance between the United States and Israel, just a realpolitik cost. But that it's covered over by this organization, or this set of organizations called the lobby, and people, really crack down on them for saying that, even though we all know it's true. AIPAC doesn't spend the amount of money it spends, to get rid of Cory Bush or other people. Because they're profligate spenders. They understand we have to get rid of anybody who really questions the foundation of this alliance.
So the question I would like to have you answer for me then is that how exactly, what are the mechanisms that keep this allegiance to the United States in the Zionist political lobby intact? If as Mearsheimer and Walt say, it's so precarious for the American realpolitik, then why does it seem to be so effective?
Honestly, I'm gonna have to plead ignorance. I mean, I think that's the big question that a lot of people ask, and I don't think I have the answer to it. But I won't answer your question, but I'll sort of steer it in a different direction. You'll remember, when the whole BDS movement arose, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, about 15 years ago. There was always this question of the analogy to South African apartheid. And both supporters of BDS and critics dealt with this question of, is there, first and foremost, is Israel like apartheid South Africa? So that was one question. But the other question was, could the approach of divestment, sanctions, and boycotts, could it work in the way that it helped to work in the 1970s and 1980s with South Africa? And here's where I think it comes to the question you're asking me. I always felt like it was a useful analogy, but for different reasons than most people felt. Because the situation with South Africa was, and apartheid South Africa in the 70s and 80s, was that apartheid had very little cultural legitimacy in the United States in the wake of the civil rights movement. Ronald Reagan never defended apartheid as a good thing. The real defense of the United States alliance with South Africa, apartheid South Africa, was the realpolitik argument that it was a critical node in fighting the Cold War, given what was going on in Angola and other countries north of South Africa. That if the United States broke with South Africa, that would open up the whole region to the Soviet Union and the communists. So it was a strictly realpolitik argument that allowed the United States government to hold on as long as it did, despite the fact that the whole idea of racial apartheid as the foundation of a country, in this case South Africa, it was too close to Jim Crow in people's memory to justify it. With Israel, you have almost the exact opposite situation. In that, I do think there are a lot of people in the foreign policy community who are like Walt and Mearsheimer. When Walt and Mearsheimer wrote that book, they weren't just speaking for themselves. They were speaking for a whole conversation that was going on amongst a lot of foreign policy state officials. You'll remember after 9/11, it was from people in the CIA who said, look, the 9/11 attacks and these terrorists, if you really want to deal with this question, you're going to have to confront the state of Israel. It wasn't, just, radical lefties who said that. It was people in the CIA and the security apparatus. So they were more clear-eyed about the costs of the alliance from a realpolitik point of view. What Israel has, which South Africa didn't have in the United States in the 70s and 80s, is this cultural hegemony, this cultural legitimacy, that it's perceived to be a good thing. The Jews are oppressed people. They survived the Holocaust. Therefore, any entity that protects them is by definition good. And so I think that's, to me, and I mean, I could be too parochial about this coming from within the Jewish community, but my sense is that part of the reason why this thing survives is there's a weird kind of ideological stranglehold for complicated reasons that the state of Israel has over American politics, and yet it's very fragile at the same time. And you see that in the sort of primary campaigns against people like Cori Bush.
Do you think possible it has to do with the fact that the United States, the form of Protestantism that the United States is rooted in, has a bit of a Zionist narrative in it? Do you think this would have worked in a Catholic country?
It's funny you say that, because one of the things in the research I did for that piece in the New Yorker, the religious group that was the most targeted in colonial America and early 19th century America was not the Jews as they were in Europe. It was Catholics. They were much lower on the totem pole. So I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of, and it's not just Protestantism. I mean, this word settler colonialism gets thrown around a lot, but I do think there's some parallels there between that whole idea of, settling this land, if you go back to the sort of the Zionist propaganda books from the 40s, they threw around like we're colonizing and we're settling the land. And they did this because they thought that it would resonate in places like Britain and the United States. So I think absolutely it's a combination of Protestantism and it's that experience, that sort of settler experience of taking the land from the heathens and making it bloom.
Yeah, that's already the dangerous rhetoric.
Yeah, it's
gets us to this position. But what I wanted to ask you also as well is that, do you see a third option politically for members of the Jewish community who don't want to get stuck in this kind of cycle of playing either to the bourgeois brokerage politics or getting stuck in this kind of game of non-allegiance politics, which what some would say would be better if it was a true allegiance? I would say would be better. But what are the options?
Well, I think, again, people can get sentimental and hokey about this, but there is a reason that a lot of Jews were at the forefront of socialist movements and communist movements, both in Europe and the United States. And, people have written about this quite a bit, but I think in the same way that Jews understood that unless Black people have equal rights of participation, democratic rights, they also understood, Jews did, that democracy had to be full and complete democracy. It couldn't just be a narrow democracy in the electoral realm. It had to be a broader social democracy. And so to me, and again, I don't think that comes out of any sort of because Jews are better people or because they're more moral or any nonsense like that. I think it comes out of a well-developed analysis that unless the society is truly equal, a genuine democracy, a deep and substantive democracy, not just at the level of the state, but throughout society as a whole. Jews are always going to be at best just a tolerated group rather than full members. And so, I think I don't like to argue too much from religious premises to political conclusions. I'm not trying to make that kind of an argument, but I do think that there is a different path forward, which involves a different kind of politics. In terms of the state of Israel, I know this seems completely utopian, but I think it's just become increasingly clear that the idea of a two-state solution is just really the rhetoric, is just the band-aid, it's just it's just a messaging machine to justify an ongoing system of racial apartheid. And so the fact of the matter is that you have two different peoples who are on the same land, and the answer to that question is what all kinds of multiracial and multicultural democracies have come to, which is that they have to share the society together. Not creating an ethno-supremacy of one group over another.
Can we expect anything different from a Kamala Harris regime in terms of Israel, Palestine, and the lobby?
No, I don't think so. I think you might have, it'll be, no, absolutely not. What will be interesting is how the pro-Palestine groups and formations deal with a President Harris. This problem is not going away. And from what I can see, I think there's a fair number of people in these movements that are absolutely committed to making themselves a big headache for a Harris administration, which I think is all to the good. I think the power calculus right now is such that I don't expect to see anything too different from the Harris administration. But I will. At the same time, I want to say that partially because this alliance has some real problems to it, and it's beginning to cause real problems within the Democratic Party coalition. I do think they're going to have to deal with it at one point or another. The question is when, and I just don't know the answer to that.
What are your thoughts on the capacity of members of the Squad or more left progressive congressional representatives being able to maintain their dedication to the Palestinian cause without fearing repercussions by the Zionist lobby, while others, AOC, kind of seem like they changed their tone?
I think it's a good question. I think that's just kind of one of those questions that, like, democratic contestation, which includes, having to fight a lot of powerful groups, is going to answer. I don't have a crystal ball about that, and I would hesitate. Honestly, I have to be honest, like, as somebody who's been involved in this issue for a very long time, I was shocked that something like the Squad at all came out as strongly as they did in the first place on these questions about the state of Israel. The fact that some of them have caved and some of them have been defeated in primaries, to me, is not nearly as astounding as the fact that two of them survived and are stronger than ever. So what you make of that, that's a prediction question that I can't answer. But I'm again, as somebody who's been involved in this for a long time, I'm more amazed that those voices emerged in the first place.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to actually kind of move on to another piece that you wrote that I actually enjoyed. In Jacobin, your piece that was published in Jacobin in July 30th. Yes, they are weird. Now, this is a good piece. Appeals to votes against Trump rooted in fear of authoritarian apocalypse puff up Republicans' sense of their own power. Just call them what they are, deeply weird people. Can you talk to us about what initiated this article? This is a very interesting article. People should check this out.
So I want to preface this. I'm sure everybody, your listeners and followers know that there's been a kind of shift in the discourse among Democrats. I think it began with Tim Walz, even before he was a vice presidential, candidate. He made this statement. I'm just going to pull it up myself because I don't want to try to paraphrase it. He was asked by Jake Tapper on one of those Sunday news shows, and he said, why do you call Trump weird instead of the way we normally have been talking, we in the media and we in the Democratic Party and liberals and so on, which is the way we've been talking about Trump is that he's an existential threat to democracy. And Walz said that he thinks that term, existential threat to democracy, even, fascism, that it gives Trump way too much power. And he said at a rally, he said, fascists depend on fear, but we're not afraid of weird people. We're a little creeped out by them, but we're not afraid. And I think it's important to focus on the opposition he drew between existential threat of democracy versus weird. Because I think when people hear that term weird, they think you're the opposite of weird is normal. And, people on the left don't like that kind of discourse of what's normal, what's not normal. It has all kinds of, implications about gender minorities and sexual minorities. And, it's not the way I think people on the left really like to talk, like, you're weird, I'm normal, that kind of thing. But Walz was not trying to play that game about weird versus normal. What he was pointing out is that basically for the last 8 years, the Democratic Party and its allies in the media and, the discourse has really painted Trump as a kind of, a threat to democracy, existential threat. And when he said that it grants them way too much power, it actually reminded me of an article I had written in 2016, also in Jacobin, when Trump, was really beginning to look like he could win. And in fact, had just won. I don't know. It was right after the election. And I really objected even then to that kind of framing of Trump because I felt like it played into the politics of fear. And I want to explain something about this because that's another term that gets thrown around a lot, the politics of fear. I think we have a sort of a crude understanding of the politics of fear, right? Which is that you say Muslims are terrorists, Black people are criminals. There's a kind of, immigrants are lawbreakers and this kind of stuff. And that's a way of inflating groups that are, often marginalized and subjugated into an enemy. And that's what we understand as the politics of fear, the Bush era. The first book I wrote was about the politics of fear. And I think the politics of fear goes a lot deeper than just inventing enemies or inflating threats. It's a way that both conservatives and liberals and sometimes leftists as well do politics, which is when they don't have a kind of positive forward-looking agenda, whether it's social democracy or equal rights for all or freedom now. When you can't believe in things like that, you fall back on the evils, threats, because the value of a threat or evil is that unlike the politics of full equality, which requires a kind of a leap of faith, the politics of evil seems like it has a kind of reality to it that's deep and enduring and real. And this is actually, political theorists have made this argument quite often, especially after the collapse of communism, we don't know what equality is. We can't really believe in freedom. But what we do know is that cruelty is an evil thing, and it's the worst thing. And so what we will do is we will construct a politics based upon avoiding or destroying evil and cruelty. In the 1990s, liberals did this with humanitarian warfare. Remember the significance of the Balkans, and the genocide in the Balkans and Rwanda. Samantha Power made her whole career based on the fact that a liberal, good society was one in which you were toppling, stopping genocide elsewhere. So there was a liberal version of it, and of course there was the conservative version of it under George W. Bush, which was, we're going to eliminate evil from the world. What are the terrorists? They're evil. This is a kind of fear-based politics that goes much, much deeper than the sort of simplistic scapegoating that we associate with the politics of fear. And I think what happened was in 2016 is that not just liberals, but a lot of people on the left started believing that they could construct a whole politics around opposing Trump as this incomprehensible eruption that was terrible and somehow reflected the truth of America, this evil, deep truth of America. And the value of that kind of politics is that, you don't have to it's meant to sort of discipline the ranks and settle disagreement within, the left or even among liberals and so forth. It's a very simple and dangerous kind of politics. I mean, in a way, it's you see this with the stuff around we were just talking about in the first half of the show around the Jewish community and the Holocaust. Well, the Holocaust was terrible, so therefore anything that stops a Holocaust from happening is worth defending. Therefore, we have to defend the state of Israel. And likewise, Trump is terrible. He represents fascism, the worst thing that ever happened to human history. And therefore, anything that stops him, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, is good. And all kinds of stuff then gets pushed under the rug and not dealt with. I mean, I see one of your commentators just, wrote in the chat there, Kamala wants to build the wall. And this is true. She denounced the wall as anti-American in 2018. She's backing this bill in Congress that didn't pass, which, was more money for the wall. So but I feel like that's what comes out of this politics of fear. And so this is a long way of getting back to your original question. What I like about the weird thing is that I think it takes the air out of that balloon, and finally it has the potential. We won't necessarily do this, but it has the potential for opening up a space for a broader conversation about the path forward for the left. And I also happen to think, I mean, it's not just the political advantage of this kind of rhetoric. I also happen to think it's true. I mean, I argued from the very beginning that Trump was much, much more he was much bigger in rhetoric than he was in reality, and that the Republicans, I mean, we've talked about this on the show a bit in the past, that the whole idea of an ascendant Republican right was wrong-headed, that in fact the right is incredibly weak, and that the discourse of fear and existential threat only adds a sense to their power. And what's needed is to come to terms with how weak they are.
That's interesting, because all of the liberals that I see in my social media spaces, they're acting like, the Third Reich is banging at the door if we don't get elected. Yeah. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And it's just a very empty political space where you can't have a serious, nuanced conversation about the fact that Kamala Harris has not said near a word about what her policy agenda is on foreign policy, and your people are expected to follow this person into the White House without ever questioning, well, what is she exactly going to do? What does she stand on?
Yeah,
And you'll get castigated for that.
yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it really comes from, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, we've been living with this kind of, vote for the lesser of two evils, for as long as I can remember. But I do think that, that kind of politics got a new lease on life in 2016 with Trump, because people really, began to believe that, he is, the sort of the heart of darkness. He really is the soul of evil. And I think also, one of the problems with all that, we forget, it's like, if you read great literature, Satan has always been the most interesting character in literature. And there's a reason for that. He's always been perceived as the truly powerful, seductive form of power that can, topple any aspiration to, a positive ideal. And, I just think, why would anybody who's on the left want to play that game? It makes no sense to me. I mean, I think it's analytically incorrect about Trump and the Republicans, about their power, but I think it's also rhetorically and politically and ideologically just a bad and boneheaded move. And what is, again, I'm not like a big supporter of Harris Walz, but one thing I appreciated about Walz is that I think he brings them a little bit down to size. And he says, when he's saying, you're weird, you're not the great threat to democracy. You're just kind of bizarre. And we have other things to deal with here.
So what exactly do we think are the remedies to the weird politics that Mr. Trump is advancing? If just calling him a fascist and a threat to democracy doesn't work, how is he defeated?
Well, I mean, first of all, we should remember that he's never won the popular vote. So the one time, he's had two elections, he actually outright lost one already. And the other one, he didn't win because he had the most votes, because he had the support of the majority. He won it because of this, institution called the Electoral College. Now, we're not getting rid of the Electoral College anytime soon, as much as I would like to. But I think that's just sort of a kind of an orienting fact. I'm not a political strategist. I don't write in order to come up with, recommendations for how to, win elections and so forth. But one of the things that I've said for quite a long time is that, I really think that the left has to, and I'm sort of embarrassed to say this because it looks like Harris and Walz have also embraced this, but I've always argued that the left should embrace the politics of freedom, that freedom and emancipation is a very capacious language that speaks to certain currents in the American tradition that in fact are quite radical. And that, I think a lot of people on the left, especially of our generation who grew up under the sort of hegemony of the right, have always been distrustful of the language of freedom because, that was Milton Friedman, that was capitalism and freedom. It was supposed to be just a kind of buzzword for neoliberal markets. But the truth of the matter is that, freedom was a word that was, heralded by the international left coming out of the French Revolution. And while the constraints on freedom have changed over time, the value of freedom and the fact that we still don't have it, I think is both true and also speaks to people's everyday experiences. And so, I mean, the problem with Harris and Walz using the words is that their policies don't really match that. But if you really want to talk about the lack of freedom in the United States today, it's, there could be a really comprehensive freedom agenda. The academic Alex Gorevich and I wrote an article called Freedom Now, where we try to develop, that argument and saying that freedom, both in the economy and outside the economy, is the fundamental question of, a neoliberal society. The lack of freedom inside the economy, and as a result of the lack of freedom inside the economy, the lack of freedom outside the economy. And I think that really is the fundamental question that all the fighting around Trump and this and that, ultimately you come back to this fundamental question about the lack of freedom within America as a capitalist society. I think I lost you.
I think we lost Pascal.
Yeah. I'm not a podcast host. I'd love to keep everybody entertained, but I can't.
Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
I just think this is a great show, and that you guys have just really wide range of guests, and I love also the common community. It's just this isn't going to change the world, but I'm glad that this you guys exist here.
Oh, thank you so much. That's awesome coming from you. That's like, wow.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, I guess we're just going to wrap up. Pascal rage.
Maybe I'm Pascal, and I hope everything's okay with him, and it's just an internet blip.
I'm sure he's actually calling me right now. Hey, we're going to wrap up. He lost power down in Florida.
Oh, yikes.
Oh, wow. That was very sudden. All right, we're going to wrap up the show. This has been a great Mau Mau Hour. Yep. Thanks again. Have a good night. Thanks.
If I tell any secrets of the Mau Mau, this oath will kill me. If I am called in the night and refuse to come, this oath will kill me. If I see anyone steal white man's property, I must help him. I must hide what he gives me and say nothing, or this oath will kill me.
The whole system in this country, the economic system, is such that jobs are scarce. Automation is limiting jobs. It's decreasing jobs. And as automation eliminates the job opportunities, legislation will not create job opportunities. All it will do is bring about friction and hostility between the two races.
You see, there will be no progressive revival if black folks are not deeply involved in it.
I will obey all orders of the Mau Mau, or this oath will kill me.